Joining us now to talk about his book, Sitting on My Headstone, Let the Dominoes Fall, is Robert Lafond. Robert, thanks so much for coming on.
Thank you.
Let's talk about the road to writing this book. What made you write the book? How'd this come about?
Well, you've got two books there, Sitting on a Headstone and Let the Dominoes Fall. Sitting on a Headstone was, I guess I could say it was planned, but I started about 3 years ago. And I recognized that my three daughters, who are now in their 40s, really had never asked any questions about what their father did before he married their mother. What I did in the war or subsequently afterwards. So I figured the best way to do that would be to write in story form everything about where I came from, how I grew up, what led me into the Army and going to Vietnam, how I wrote letters to her mother, how we married, et cetera, et cetera. And it came out, I thought it came out very well.
And tell us about that. So in the book, what did you talk about what you did before you got married, and you and I talked off the air, you really had some interesting things to say. Tell us a little bit about what's in Sitting on My Headstone.
Well, I start out I was born in Pawtucket, Rhode Island, and we lived in a very small apartment. And it was second floor, and back in the 40s, it was right after the war. My mother and father had just married, and Dad had a job, but it wasn't enough. He had to get a second job. The apartment was growing smaller as my parents had children, and when there were four of us sleeping in one bed, we moved to an apartment that was available. Actually, it was half a house available several miles away in another town. We grew up with the children adding up to 9. But in the course of all that, it was playing by the railroad tracks, by the old mill on the river, walking to school, yes, uphill in the snow, as the old story goes. And it was good. It was country living. I mean, I wouldn't call it civilized country. It was country living. All houses were built for the mill, the factory, that provided blankets and linens and things in the beginning of the Civil War. It changed over in time to fabric, and then eventually all that died away, and it started making fiberglass.
Wow.
As I grew up and got away from the village, I was 18 when I left, and that's when I joined the military, joined the Army. My dad was in the Army all the years that I was growing up. He was in the National Guard, and one of his greatest things to sit down and watch television was watching all the war movies that were out. And every time he'd see the bombers and the planes on television, he'd point out to my brother and I, see, look at the tail of the plane, and you'll see the big A on the tail. And that was his outfit. And that's where I got my desire to join the Army and become part of an aviation lifestyle.
Yeah. Well, and obviously Sitting on My Headstone, what a clever name. And I understand, leaving this for your family. But what about for anybody listening to this conversation, reading it? What do you hope they take away from reading that book?
The story, it goes to show that the term "sitting on a headstone," I use it in the book many times, particularly in in Vietnam, and of course with combat in Vietnam and all the guys that are going in harm's way, it's that you're sitting on a headstone, and if you don't look down to see that your name's on the stone, no matter what you're doing, and you want to avoid winding up in the grave. So you do what you can, and sitting on a headstone, I think, is a story of endurance, because I not only did my initial 12 months, I volunteered to do an additional 6, which is, at the end of those 6 months, is how I was injured and how I spent time in the military hospitals and the VA hospitals, and eventually getting married, and surviving through the PTSD that I sustained and the injuries that I sustained and how I lived through them. And I wanted my kids to know all that, because they just they don't ask questions. They're not curious in that respect. But I wanted them to know, in case they did get curious. They can at least, in time, be able to show their children, my grandchildren, something that their grandfather did. That was probably different from what they may be living in their own neighborhoods. Because, let's face it, Vietnam veterans we're not few, but we're far in between. And many of them hide, and they don't talk about their experiences. I did. I decided I had to.
And I think that's one of the great gems of this book, is that not just for your family, but for others to know that and to understand that and hear those stories, I think is so, so valuable. And your other book, Let the Dominoes Fall, tell us about that. What's that about?
That's far and away different. It's based on current events. And at the time I started the book, current event was President Trump in the White House. It's based on the activities of the president and certain members of his cabinet who face a bit of retribution by another member in the House and the Senate who's looking to make changes. And I start the book out with a group of students graduating from high school, going on to college, and how their lives, though they become separated, begin to intertwine again. And they are the catalysts of